Hello, it is April 23rd, 2020, and today I'm going back to the book of James to look at some more practical thoughts about the Christian life. As I said yesterday, James gives us a lot of practical truth about the Christian life and how we ought to live the Christian life. But there's an interesting phrase that I found in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the book of James that seems, when you read it, to be contradictory. And that's found in James chapter 1 and verse number 25. But I want to start in verse 22 and lead up to verse 25. Verse 22 says, "But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. For if any be a hearer of the word, and not a doer, he is like unto a man beholding his natural face in a glass. For he beholdeth himself, and goeth his way, and straightway forgetteth what manner of man he was. But whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty, and continueth therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed." That phrase is the phrase in verse 25, the perfect law of liberty. Now that term, the law of liberty, seems on the surface to be somewhat contradictory. When we think of liberty, we often associate with it the right or the freedom to do as we desire. And when we think about law, we think of the opposite. We think of that which constrains the actions of men, or that which compels us to not do as we would want to do. When I think of laws, for example, in our country, we have laws that regulate the speed that we can drive on the freeway. And in the mind, oftentimes we consider liberty would be the freedom to drive as fast as I want to. And the law saying 55 miles per hour is a constraining law that constricts my liberty. So on the surface, this idea of a law of liberty seems contradictory. How do you have liberty when law is designed to prevent us from doing certain things? Yet the Bible refers to itself as that perfect law of liberty. The concept here is not that liberty is us doing what it is we want, but rather that liberty is us being free from the constraints and the restrictions and the punishment and the consequence that comes from sin when we do as we would desire. In all of us, there exists a desire to do that which is wrong. And James refers to that. In fact, if we were to go up just a little bit in chapter number 1, look at verse number 12, it says, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren." The law of God was given to us so that we could live in the liberty of living outside of the consequence of sin. That's the whole purpose of the law of God. And by living in that law, within the confines of the restrictions that God has placed, within the boundaries that God has designed, we find the true liberty of the Christian life. Let's go all the way back to the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve were created, God did not give Adam and Eve complete liberty to do as they pleased without consequence. Now, God gave them the liberty to choose. But he told Adam, when he created Adam, that to choose wrongly would result in severe consequence, the consequence of death. So though Adam was at liberty to choose, the choice of sin would remove from Adam the liberation of consequence. He would then have to deal with the consequences of his sin. When God created Adam in the Garden of Eden, he gave Adam a commandment. He told them, be fruitful and multiply, Adam and Eve. Then he gave them a responsibility, placed them in the garden to dress and to keep it. And then he gave them a restriction and said, of all the trees of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. So God gave Adam boundaries, and within the boundaries that God gave Adam or provided for Adam and Eve, they were at liberty. But as soon as they stepped outside those boundaries, they were then under the chains and consequences of sin. That's how law brings liberty to us. Law frees us from the binds and the consequence of sin. When somebody says, I can just do as I want as a Christian, I can do as I please, what we do when we walk back into sin is we then find ourselves under the constraints, we find ourselves under the binds of sin. Sin is a powerful force. There are consequences to sin. Romans talks about how we were dead to sin once and we are freed from the bondage of sin through Jesus Christ, and then says, now let not sin reign in your mortal body. Because sin is a controlling force, it is a binding force, it is an enslaving force. So where we find true liberty in the Christian life is not when we think we have the liberty to do as we please, but it's when we understand that God has given us a law in His Word. And if we live within the boundaries of the law that God has placed, we will find true liberty. That's what it's talking about in James chapter 1. It says we look into that glass, and if we walk away from it and forget what manner of person we are, nothing has changed. But when we look into that perfect law of liberty, verse 25, and continue therein, he being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. And one of the blessings we find is true liberty in the Christian life. Heeding the word of God, living within his boundaries, brings liberty. That phrase is also found in James chapter number 2. And it talks about that down in verse 12. But if we read into it, beginning with verse 10, for whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. For he that said, do not commit adultery, said also, do not kill. Now if thou commit no adultery, yet if thou kill, thou become a transgressor of the law. So speak ye, and so do, as they that shall be judged by, again, that phrase, the law of liberty. So that concept again, that God has given us law for a purpose, and the purpose of living in law. You say, well, law takes away my rights and keeps me from doing all the things I may want to do. That may be true, but the purpose of the law is to free us from the consequence and bondage of sin that comes from living outside the boundaries that God set. God's boundaries are for the purpose of liberating us to live a truly free and joyous Christian life. When I think of that, I think of things like sheep. The Bible calls us sheep. The Bible says we are like sheep. And that place of protection for that sheep is in the fold with the master. The sheep says, I'm going to go my own way. I have liberty to do as I want and walk where I please and be where I please, and walks outside the boundaries of where the shepherd wants him to be. That sheep has now put himself at risk of being hurt and killed. But it's within the boundaries that shepherd places for that sheep that he will find the freest and most joyful life. And it's the same thing for us. Within the boundaries of that law of liberty, we find true peace in the joy and safety in the Christian life. God bless you, and we will see you again very soon.